I would ask to be recognized. I would like to talk about a couple of amendments to the legislation that we're considering this week, which is the human trafficking legislation. This has been, up to this point, a bipartisan exercise. In fact, Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut and I started a caucus here in the Senate on human trafficking about 3.5 years ago, understanding that there was increasing concern about and awareness of this issue around the country. We wanted to bring our colleagues together to talk about the issue. We now have many other members of the Senate who are part of that. We have met monthly, having meetings, holding up people who are doing great things around the country, also describing the problem so that all of us, members of the Senate and their staff, understand the seriousness of this issue and why we need to address it. That has always been nonpartisan, not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan. I think it's time for us to move forward with this debate, to have these amendments offered, and to actually vote on this legislation that would help to deal with this problem all around the country. And unfortunately, it's everywhere. Often people think this is an international issue, that only human trafficking concern we should have would be in Africa or Asia or other countries. But actually, it happens right here. And it happens in my home state of Ohio. I first got involved in this issue when a school outside of the city of Toledo came to me and told me about their concern about it. These young people were getting involved and engaged in it. And the more we learned, the more I looked into it, the more I realized this is something that's very real in my communities I represent in Ohio. And the same is true, unfortunately, I believe, in every state represented in this chamber. We have had an interesting debate so far. Sometimes we've gotten a little sidetracked on issues we just saw a moment ago, but for the most part, I've been pleased that over the last few days, we've talked about the scope of the problem. We've talked about some of the solutions to it. We've talked about some of the good legislation that's in the underlying bill. There are two pieces of legislation that I authored that are part of the underlying bill. I'm happy about that. They're both bipartisan. And then there's a couple of amendments that I think would be very helpful for us to include in the legislation. I offered those amendments earlier this week with the hopes that they would have already been considered. They have not been considered yet, but again, I hope we can move forward with this. The longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes for us to move forward, I believe. So I hope we can resolve whatever differences there are and go ahead and start voting on amendments and moving this forward so that we can actually help those victims of trafficking who are looking for our support. And again, you know, if we aren't going to act here in the Senate and aren't going to move this forward in the House and get it to the President for signature every day, more and more people are in danger, particularly children, of falling into the hands of human traffickers. A couple of amendments I want to talk about briefly today, if I could. The first is called Ensuring a Better Response for Victims of Sex Trafficking. This amendment contains a piece of the legislation that I actually offered a couple of years ago with Senator Wyden of Oregon. And Senator Wyden's legislation and my legislation, called the Child Sex Trafficking Data and Response Act, was partly enacted into law already. It was enacted into law last year, and that was the data part of the bill. In other words, the part of the bill that relates to how do we improve the information we're getting on sex trafficking so we can better address the problem. Law enforcement officials have been looking for better information around the country. They want to know what the best practices are and how to deal with it. And so the scope of the problem is important. To understand the problem is important to come up with solutions. Now we need to get to the second part of the legislation that was not enacted last year, and that's on the response portion. The amendment does just that. The response portion of the bill changes the way we treat victims of sex trafficking. Right now, many of these victims are just falling between the cracks. Currently, children are only eligible for help through the child welfare system if they are abused by their parents. Currently, because children are only allowed to be eligible for help in that category, some kids just cannot get the help that they need. This legislation ensures that all children who are trafficked are considered sexual victims of sexual abuse, and can be eligible for services as they go through what is sometimes a long and arduous process of recovery. The second amendment I want to include gets at some of the underlying problems that make it more likely that a child will be trafficked. And we've heard a lot about this on the floor the last couple of days. I've talked about it in terms of our missing children. One of the elements of the underlying bill is a bill that we put forward last couple of years on how to identify missing children. Why? Because those children who are runaways or go missing tend to be some of the most vulnerable to sex traffickers. And so the idea is let's get the best information we can on those kids as soon as possible to find them. As an example, there have been about 67 kids who have gone missing in Ohio in the last month and a half, and yet we only have records for 20-some kids. I think it's 26 kids in terms of photographs. And so this legislation would require photographs for all these kids, so that the kids that are not currently able to be found because you can't find a photograph of them, you can't get a photograph, can be more easily found, not just by law enforcement, but by citizens who are being vigilant and diligent. But there's another issue, too, and this is something that is addressed in this amendment, which is co-sponsored by Senator Feinstein. So the first one is one out of a Wyden-Portman bill, and this is out of a Feinstein-Portman bill. So these are bipartisan bills. And it currently is true that there is an over-narrow definition of homelessness by the Department of Housing and Urban Development that does not enable homeless kids to get the help that they need. That's current law. So we're trying to change that to ensure that we can expand that definition to include the kind of children who, unfortunately, many times are, again, vulnerable to trafficking. Let me give you an example of the scope of this problem. During this last school year, 2 years ago now, 2012, 2013, there were 24,236 kids in Ohio who were homeless at one point during the school year. However, the federal department responsible for preventing child homelessness counted only 4,700 cases. So you got over 24,000 kids who are homeless, and yet this department says only 4,700. In other words, the very program meant to help these kids undercount it by a factor of 5. So the amendment simply updates the definition of homelessness to ensure these kids are not forgotten. They don't fall between the cracks. We know that this action alone isn't going to end child homelessness, but it will help to deal with this problem. It'll help put a roof over their heads for thousands of these kids and their families and prevent some of the long-term emotional, developmental effects that are caused by homelessness, as well as keeping these kids off the streets and hopefully away from these traffickers so they're not vulnerable, as I said, to being sex trafficked. We hope for a day when every single child in America is protected, where every child is able to follow their dreams, can live in a home with a family that's protecting them, watching over them. We know that if we're going to see that hope realized, though, we've got to fight for it. And in the meantime, we've got important work to do here in the floor of the Senate to ensure we're doing everything we possibly can to protect these kids. These two amendments will help make this underlying legislation even stronger. I hope my colleagues will support both of them. And again, I hope we can now get over whatever is holding up movement on these amendments, get these amendments enacted into law, get the bill over to the House of Representatives, who I believe they will pass it, get it to the President for his signature so we can indeed begin to address this horrific practice of human trafficking.